In the year 1904, deep within the mist-laden hills of Pennsylvania, there stood an estate both revered and feared, the House of Duvall. Its iron gates groaned like mourners, its stone walls loomed with the weight of centuries, and its windows flickered with a restless glow, as though the house itself drew breath. To outsiders, it was merely an aging mansion belonging to an old and secretive family, but those who lived near its shadow knew better. They whispered of a bargain struck long ago, of a curse that demanded a bride each year to keep its walls from crumbling into the soil. The chosen women entered with hope and left only as names carved in hidden stone. On a chill autumn evening, a young bride named Eleanor Whitmore arrived at those gates, her pale dress catching the light of a fading Sunday. She believed she was stepping into a marriage of privilege. Instead, she was walking into the hunger of the house itself. Sorry for the interruption. Where are you tuning in from? Drop it in the comments. The year was 1904, and the autumn air in rural Pennsylvania carried with it the brittle chill of endings. A lone carriage rattled along the muddy road, its wheels crunching against gravel as it approached the iron gates of the Duvall Estate. The gates themselves were towering things, ornate and blackened with age, their bars entwined with vines that had withered long ago. As the driver pulled the reins, the horses snorted, stamping nervously as though they too sensed the weight of what lay beyond. Inside the carriage sat Eleanor Whitmore. Only 19, she wore a dress of pale cream that seemed far too delicate for the journey she had taken, its fabric brushing against her gloved hands as she clasped them tightly in her lap. Her face was composed, but her eyes betrayed. Her eyes that flickered between hope, uncertainty, and an unspoken fear. She had been chosen, as all brides before her had been chosen, to marry Edward Duvall, heir to the estate and the last of his name. It was said to be an honor, a step into wealth and refinement, yet the road here felt more like a passage into exile. The gates creaked open without a touch. No servant came forward to greet her, no groundskeeper to turn the key. The iron bars simply yawned apart, as if acknowledging her arrival with silent inevitability. The carriage passed through, wheels jolting over the threshold, and the sound of them seemed to echo louder once inside the estate grounds. The Duvall mansion revealed itself in fragments. At first a cluster of high stone walls half hidden by the fog, then a row of sharp gables piercing the sky. Gas lamps flickered weakly in the mist, illuminating windows so tall and narrow they resembled watchful eyes. The building was massive, sprawling across the hill like some slumbering beast. Though it was grand in its design, with carved balconies and towering chimneys, there was no warmth to it, no light spilling from its windows, no music or laughter to suggest a home. It was not a place where families lived. It was a place that endured. The carriage shuddered to a halt before the front steps. Eleanor gathered her skirts, hesitating as her shoes touched the stone drive. The horses fidgeted, tossing their heads, and for a moment she felt the absurd desire to climb back inside, to command the driver to turn around and take her away from this place. But the driver did not meet her gaze, and when her feet touched the ground, the carriage lurched forward, rolling away into the mist as if eager to be rid of her. Alone now, Eleanor stood before the mansion. The heavy doors loomed, carved with symbols she did not recognize, flowers twisted into knots, figures with veiled faces, her breath caught in her throat. The silence around her was so complete that even the rustling of her dress against her ankles seemed intrusive. With trembling hands, she reached for the iron knocker. It was cold, bitterly cold, as though it had never once been warmed by the touch of the living. When the doors swung open, it was not by her hand. The doors opened with a groan, so heavy it reverberated through Eleanor's bones, and the vast entrance hall of the Duvall estate revealed itself in dim light. Gas lamps flickered in their sconces along the walls, their glow failing to banish the shadows that lingered in the corners. The air was cool, stale, as though the house had not been aired in decades. Her footsteps echoed sharply across the black and white tiled floor, the sound swallowed almost immediately by the suffocating stillness of the place. The space was magnificent, but not in a way that comforted. The ceilings rose impossibly high, from which hung chandeliers of crystal and brass, each flame trembling in its glass chamber, as if afraid. The stairs climbed upward in twin spirals, their banisters carved with roses and vines that seemed too lifelike, their petals curled as though frozen mid-bloom. Every surface glistened faintly with dust that sparkled under the gaslight, a glittering reminder of years left untouched. But it was the portraits that held her. Hung in gilded frames along the walls, they stretched higher than any gallery Eleanor had ever seen. Each depicted a woman in a bridal gown, the lace and satin painted with painstaking precision. Their faces, though varied, shared a pallor and stillness that unsettled her. Some smiled faintly, others looked resigned, but every pair of eyes seemed to follow her as she moved across the room. She tried not to look at them, yet her gaze was pulled back again and again. The painted women seemed to lean forward ever so slightly, their pupils gleaming in the light as though waiting to see what Eleanor would do. She caught herself holding her breath, convinced that if she blinked too long, one of them might shift in the frame, or whisper, or reach through the canvas with pale hands. A draught stirred the air, carrying with it the faint scent of extinguished candles. The flame of the nearest lamp sputtered, casting the hall into a trembling half-darkness, and Eleanor's skin prickled with the sensation of being observed not by one presence, but by the house itself. The walls seemed to press inward, the silence thickening into something almost alive. She placed her hand on the banister, the wood icy beneath her fingers, and tried to steady herself. The mansion loomed in every direction, stretching out in corridors lined with closed doors, each one holding its own secrets. She told herself it was only her imagination, that the eyes on the walls were no more than pigment and varnish. Yet as she stood alone in that cavernous hall, Eleanor felt certain the estate itself was aware of her, and that it was waiting. From the far end of the hall, where the shadows seemed to cling most heavily, a figure emerged. Eleanor froze, her hand still on the banister, her breath caught between relief and apprehension. Edward Duvall stepped into the dim glow of the gas lamps, tall and composed, his presence both graceful and unsettling. He moved with a calm deliberation, as though each step had been rehearsed countless times before, and yet there was no mistaking the faint weight in his posture, as if he bore something invisible upon his shoulders. His face was pale, angular, with features that seemed carved more than born high cheekbones, a sharp jaw, eyes that lingered too long when they settled on hers. When he extended his hand to greet her, Eleanor reached forward, only to flinch at the chill of his skin. It was not merely cold, like a man unused to warmth, but the kind of cold that suggested the absence of life itself. He did not seem to notice her unease. "You've arrived safely," he said, his voice low and measured, each word carefully chosen. "The house has been waiting." Eleanor's lips parted, though she could not find the words to answer. The way he said it, as though the house itself were alive, unsettled her more than the portraits had. She finally managed a polite nod, murmuring her thanks, though it sounded hollow in her ears. Edward studied her in silence, his expression unreadable, before he turned slightly, motioning for her to follow him deeper into the estate. As they walked, his presence filled the space in a way that no sound could. He spoke sparingly, his voice drifting like a quiet current through the corridors. "This place is old, Eleanor," he said, almost to himself. "Older than the stones, older than the family name carved above the gates. It requires certain observances to remain at peace." She frowned, her gloved hands brushing her skirts as they moved. "Observances?" she asked carefully. He gave a faint smile that never reached his eyes. "Nothing burdensome. Traditions, you could say. Small acts that remind the house it is not forgotten." There was an emphasis to the words "remind the house" that struck her. She wanted to press him, to ask what he truly meant, but something in his demeanor held her back. He spoke not as though offering information, but as though testing her willingness to listen. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the echo of their footsteps across the wooden floors. As he guided her past endless halls of closed doors and towering windows curtained against the night, Eleanor could not help but feel that his every word carried something unsaid, and that the answers she sought were hidden deliberately in the shadows between them. That first night in the Duvall Estate, Eleanor lay in the vast canopy bed that seemed designed more for ceremony than for rest. The velvet curtains enclosed her like the folds of a coffin, and the ceiling above rose so high it dissolved into shadow. A fire crackled in the hearth at the far end of the chamber, but its warmth never reached her. She pulled the quilts tighter, though it wasn't the cold that kept her awake. It was the sound. At first, it was subtle, the faintest scraping somewhere behind the walls. She told herself it was mice or the settling of wood. Old houses often groaned with age, but the noise returned again and again, growing sharper, longer, as though fingernails were dragging across the hidden beams. Eleanor held her breath and listened, the rhythm unmistakable, almost deliberate. Then came the whispers. Soft at first, barely distinguishable from the sigh of the wind, they threaded through the silence like strands of silk. A voice, or perhaps many, murmured just beyond the plaster, low and urgent, carrying words she could not fully grasp. She strained her ears, heart hammering, until one syllable emerged with clarity. Her name. Eleanor. Her blood ran cold. She sat upright in bed, clutching the quilt to her chest, staring at the walls as if she might see lips moving through them. The fire popped violently, and the sound in the walls fell silent. For a moment, she almost convinced herself she had imagined it. The following morning, she mentioned the noises to a maid while tea was being poured. The girl, pale-faced and evasive, forced a brittle smile. "Just the pipes, miss," she said quickly. "The house is old, and the pipes shift in the night. Nothing more." But Eleanor caught the flicker of fear in her eyes, the way her hands trembled as she set down the teacup, spilling a drop across the saucer. The reassurance was rehearsed, the way one tells a child there are no monsters under the bed. That night, the sounds returned stronger. The scratching spread along the walls, as though something crawled within them, circling her bed. The whispers rose in chorus, distinctly feminine now, soft and coaxing. She could almost make out phrases, please, fragments of sorrow, fragments of warning. "Stay with us, join us." Her throat tightened, a scream caught just behind her lips. She pressed her hands to her ears, but the voices seeped through skin and bone, filling her skull until she could no longer tell if they came from the walls or from within her own mind. Alone in the suffocating dark, Eleanor realized that the house was not silent at all. It was speaking. And it knew her name. Morning light filtered weakly through the mansion's long windows, pale and gray as though the sun itself hesitated to touch the Duvall Estate. Eleanor moved through the halls alone, her footsteps muffled on thick carpets and marble floors. The house seemed endless, each corridor branching into another, each door leading to chambers filled with dust and silence. Though she tried to steady her mind with the thought that she was merely learning her new home, curiosity carried her deeper into places that felt untouched for years. It was during this wandering that she found the locked wing. At the end of a long hallway, darker than the others and lined with shutters that had been nailed shut, she came upon a double door banded with iron. Rusted locks sealed it from top to bottom, 4 in total, their chains hanging like shackles. Dust and cobwebs thickened the air here, and the smell was different damp stone, something stagnant, as though whatever lay beyond had been forgotten by the living. Eleanor reached out, her fingers brushing one of the locks. It was ice cold despite the warmth of the morning, and the chill traveled up her hand into her wrist. Before she could study it further, a voice broke the stillness. "Miss Whitmore." Eleanor turned quickly to see one of the servants standing several paces behind her, a thin woman with hollow eyes and a face worn by years of silence. Her apron was plain, her hands folded neatly before her, yet there was an unease in her gaze that made Eleanor step back from the door. "You mustn't linger here," the servant said. Her tone was polite, but beneath it lay something heavier fear. "What is this place?" Eleanor asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "Why is it locked?" The woman's lips tightened, as if the question itself was forbidden. After a pause, she answered in a whisper. "No bride goes there." The words were simple, but they struck Eleanor with a weight she could not explain. No bride goes there. Not should, not must, but does not. As if it were not simply forbidden, but impossible. The servant lowered her eyes and stepped aside, gesturing softly for Eleanor to return the way she had come. Eleanor obeyed, though her thoughts remained with the rusted chains and sealed doors. As she moved away, she could not shake the feeling that something on the other side had stirred at her presence, something patient and waiting. And though she did not look back, she felt the weight of that locked wing pressing against her spine, like a gaze she could not escape. That evening, Eleanor was summoned to the great dining hall. A fire blazed in the hearth, throwing long, restless shadows against the vaulted ceiling. The table stretched nearly the length of the room, set with crystal goblets, silver cutlery, and platters of delicacies she had not seen since leaving her family's home. Roasted pheasant, candied fruits, and decanters of wine gleamed under the trembling light of 100 candles. It was a feast meant for a gathering, yet only 2 places had been laid. Edward rose as she entered, dressed in a dark suit that seemed stitched from shadow itself. His composure was flawless, yet when his cold hand touched hers in greeting, Eleanor felt again the unnerving chill of him, as though the warmth of the fire could not reach his flesh. He guided her to her seat with practiced grace, his smile brief and unreadable. She lowered herself into the chair, the weight of the room pressing around her. The servants stood along the walls, silent and still, their faces downcast. None met her eyes, none spoke. They were like figures carved from stone, only moving when Edward lifted a hand for them to pour wine or serve the next dish. It was then she noticed the chair. Halfway down the table, directly across from her, stood a single chair draped in lace. Its cushion remained untouched, its goblet filled but never lifted. No food graced the plate before it. The lace shimmered faintly in the candlelight, pale and delicate as a bridal veil. Eleanor's chest tightened at the sight, and though she tried to turn her gaze away, her eyes drifted back again and again. The chair seemed less empty than waiting. Edward raised his glass. "To devotion," he said softly, his voice carrying across the vast table. "To the house that shelters us, and to the bride who gives herself freely." The words settled over Eleanor like frost. She forced herself to lift her glass, though the wine trembled against the rim. She wondered if the toast was meant for her or for the unseen presence occupying that vacant chair. The servants did not echo his words, nor did they raise their glasses. They only watched, their silence more unsettling than any whisper in the walls. Eleanor sipped, the bitterness of the wine catching at her throat, and for the first time she felt truly ensnared in a ritual she did not yet understand. When Edward lowered his glass, his eyes lingered on hers. "The house is pleased," he said, and though he smiled faintly, Eleanor could not shake the feeling that it was not him who had spoken. The master bedroom was unlike any chamber Eleanor had seen in the estate. Its walls were draped in velvet, the color of dried blood, and a great canopy bed dominated the center, carved with roses whose petals seemed to curl inward like dying blooms. Candles burned on every surface mantel, writing desk, bedside table. Yet the room remained cloaked in shadow, as if the flames dared not extend too far. The air was heavy, perfumed faintly with lavender gone stale. Eleanor paused at the threshold, her breath catching in her throat. Upon the pillow lay a veil. Thin, almost translucent, its lace shimmered faintly in the candlelight. The fabric was yellowed with age, its edges frayed, and when she reached out to touch it, her fingers recoiled at the chill clinging to it. It was not hers. She had never worn such a thing. And yet, it waited for her, as though laid out with intention. Edward appeared behind her, silent as ever, and his voice filled the room with a calm that was more command than comfort. "It belonged to the bride before you," he said, stepping closer. His shadow stretched long across the bed. "Each bride must wear the veil of the one who came before her. It is tradition." Eleanor turned, her lips parting with protest, though no sound emerged. The thought of resting her head where another bride had once done, of covering her face with cloth that had belonged to a woman now gone, filled her with unease. Why? She managed finally, her voice hushed. Edward's eyes fixed on her, dark and unwavering. Because the house remembers, he said simply. It carries what it has been given. To deny its memory is to invite unrest. His words lingered in the air, and though he said no more, she understood there would be no arguing. The veil was not a choice but a demand, as much a part of the ceremony as the vows themselves. Later, when the candles had been dimmed and the fire's embers glowed faintly, Eleanor sat upon the edge of the bed, the veil trembling in her hands. She lifted it slowly, the lace falling across her face, and a shiver ran down her spine as if unseen fingers traced her skin. In the silence, she thought she heard faint laughter, soft and sorrowful, rising from the fabric itself. She closed her eyes tightly, clutching the veil, and tried to will herself into sleep. Yet the thought circled endlessly in her mind that she was not the first to wear it, and if the house demanded it, she would not be the last. The days in the Duvall Estate passed slowly, measured not by clocks but by the weight of silence that pressed on Eleanor's shoulders. Each corridor she walked seemed to breathe around her, each portrait to follow her steps. She had begun to notice peculiar drafts in her chamber, small currents of air that stirred the curtains even when the windows were latched. One morning, determined to find their source, she knelt near the far corner of her room and pressed her palm against the wooden floorboards. It was there she felt it, an uneven rise beneath the rug. With hesitant fingers, she pulled the rug aside and traced the outline of a board that had been pried open before. The nails were loose, rusted with age. Heart racing, Eleanor fetched a letter opener and wedged it into the gap. With a sharp tug, the board lifted free, groaning like a secret unwilling to be revealed. Inside the hollow space lay a small leather-bound book. Its cover was cracked, its edges worn, but the initials M.D. were still faintly visible on its spine. Dust clung to it like a second skin. Eleanor brushed it clean and opened to the first page. The handwriting was delicate, feminine, yet trembling, as if written in haste. The 12th of June, 1889. My name is Margaret Duvall. If anyone should ever read this, know that I was the bride that year, and know that the house does not forgive neglect. Eleanor's hands tightened around the book. She turned the pages slowly, each entry spilling fragments of a life consumed. Margaret wrote of her marriage to Edward, of the cold beauty of the estate, of the way the servants avoided her gaze. At first, her words carried hope, the kind Eleanor herself had carried upon her arrival. But as the entries deepened, the tone shifted. The house grows restless. I hear it in the walls, in the sigh of the pipes, in the silence of the servants. Edward says it must be given what it desires, or it will take by force. He tells me to trust him, to trust tradition. But each day, I feel it watching, waiting, hungering. Eleanor's throat tightened as she read further. Margaret described the annual rituals, veils passed down, suppers where an empty chair sat draped in lace. She spoke of voices calling in the night, voices that begged for company, voices that promised release if only she would give herself to them. The final entry was brief, the ink blurred as though written in haste. Tomorrow is the night. Edward says it is the only way. If I do not write again, let this be my witness. The house remembers, and it always demands. Eleanor closed the diary with trembling fingers. For the first time since arriving, she felt less like a guest and more like an inheritor of something vast and merciless. The floorboard groaned as she slid the book back into its hollow, but the words lingered in her chest like an echo she could not silence. Margaret had once lived in this same room, and the house had claimed her. Now it waited for Eleanor. The rhythm of life within the Duvall estate began to falter. At first, Eleanor hardly noticed it. One maid gone from the breakfast room, another absent from the evening turn-down. She assumed they had been dismissed or sent away on errands. Yet as the days crept forward, the absences grew impossible to ignore. The once bustling staff dwindled until only a few familiar faces remained, moving through the corridors with downcast eyes and hurried steps. Eleanor approached one of the older servants, a woman who had silently poured her tea each morning. "Where is Clara?" she asked, remembering the bright-eyed maid who had carried her trunk upon her arrival. The woman's hand shook as she poured, spilling a thin line of tea into the saucer. She gave no reply, only bowed her head and left the room without a word. That evening, Eleanor found Edward in the library, seated by the fire with a book he seemed not to be reading. The flames cast shadows against his sharp features, his expression serene, almost studied. Gathering her courage, she asked, "Why are the servants leaving? Each day there are fewer." Edward closed the book with careful precision and set it upon the table. He did not look at her as he answered, "They have not left." Her breath caught. "Then where are they?" Finally, he lifted his gaze, his pale eyes fixed upon hers with a calm that felt more chilling than anger. "The house requires them." Eleanor stared, waiting for an explanation, but none came. The silence pressed against her ears, heavy and final. She wanted to demand more, to force him to explain, but something in his tone, soft, unshaken, made her stomach twist with fear. It was not the answer itself that terrified her, but the certainty with which he spoke it. That night, as she lay in bed, Eleanor strained to hear the faintest sounds through the walls. Once, she thought she heard footsteps in the locked wing, dragging and uneven. Another time, a low moan, so muffled she wondered if it was only the groan of old timbers. Yet when she pressed her ear against the wall, she thought she could make out whispers pleading, fading, dissolving into nothing. The next morning, the hallways seemed emptier still. Trays were left unattended, dust gathered on the staircase banister, and the grand house that once pulsed with silent service now throbbed with absence. Eleanor walked its corridors, feeling the weight of invisible eyes. She thought of Margaret's diary, of the words the house remembers, and knew with dreadful certainty that the servants had not simply vanished, they had been consumed. And with each disappearance, the house grew quieter, hungrier, as if saving its appetite for her. The morning air was cool, a mist curling low across the grounds as Eleanor wandered from the suffocating halls into the estate's courtyard. She sought respite, some measure of quiet away from the suffocating weight of silence inside the house. The garden stretched wide, overgrown with ivy and roses gone wild, their thorns clutching at the stone walls like desperate hands. At first glance, it seemed nothing more than a neglected corner of the estate, where nature had begun to reclaim what man had abandoned. But as she stepped deeper into the greenery, Eleanor noticed the strange symmetry of stones half buried beneath vines. Their shapes were too deliberate to be mere garden rocks. Pushing back the heavy ivy with trembling fingers, she uncovered the smooth surface of a small gravestone. Her breath caught as she read the inscription. 1872, bride. That was all. No name, no epitaph, no loving farewell. Only the year, and the word that reduced a woman's entire existence to a single roll. Heart-hammering, Eleanor moved to another stone, tugging the ivy back more urgently this time. The same word, the same cruel anonymity. 1873. Bride. One by one, she revealed them, a grim row of markers swallowed by creeping vines. Each stone bore only a year, stretching in an unbroken line toward the courtyard wall. Some years repeated, others skipped, but the pattern was unmistakable, an unending cycle. Her stomach twisted as she realized the truth. The house had been fed, year after year, and these stones were all that remained of those who had come before her. A breeze stirred the ivy, whispering across the stones as if the garden itself exhaled. Eleanor knelt, her fingers brushing the rough carving of a date barely legible beneath moss. It was not decades old, it was from only last year. She recoiled, her throat tightening, and turned to look back at the house. Its windows glared down upon her, reflecting the gray morning light like watchful eyes. She thought of Margaret's diary, of the final entry written in trembling hand, and wondered if one of these stones belonged to her. Did each bride's fate end here, her body absorbed into the soil while her name was erased from history? The garden seemed to close in around Eleanor, the ivy rustling though there was no wind. For a fleeting moment, she fancied she heard faint voices in the leaves, murmurs too soft to understand, as if the brides themselves lingered, bound to the earth where they were hidden. She rose, her legs unsteady, and fled back toward the house. Yet the image of those stones remained carved into her mind, a procession of nameless women leading to her own place in the line. The garden had shown her what the estate demanded, and it was only a matter of time before it came to claim her. The storm came without warning, sweeping across the hills with a fury that shook the very foundations of the Duvall Estate. Rain lashed against the windows, streaking the glass until the world outside blurred into a torrent of shadow and water. Thunder rolled overhead like the growl of some unseen beast, and each lightning flash lit the corridors in ghostly brilliance. Eleanor pressed herself against the wall of her chamber, clutching Margaret's diary against her chest as though it might shield her. Yet the storm was not the only thing that unsettled her. For as the wind howled, the house itself seemed to stir in response. She heard the first sound when the door across the hall groaned open, though she knew no one was there. She stepped into the corridor, her candlelight quivering in her grip, and saw it swinging gently on its hinges. A sudden gust sent the curtains at the far end billowing outward in violent arcs, though the windows behind them were latched tight. Eleanor's skin prickled. The house was not merely reacting to the storm, it was feeding on it. Each crack of thunder rattled the chandeliers above, sending prisms of fractured light across the portraits of past brides. Their painted eyes seemed more alive than ever, shimmering as though the storm had woken them. Eleanor's steps echoed unnaturally loud, her own presence swallowed by a silence that pressed in after each boom of thunder. Then came the pull. It began as a faint tug low in her chest, subtle enough she might have mistaken it for nerves. But with each step she took down the hall, it grew stronger, more insistent. It was not her will that drew her onward, but the will of the house. The pull led her toward the forbidden place, the locked wing. The great double doors loomed in the flickering candlelight, their rusted locks glistening with damp as though the storm itself had seeped through the walls. Eleanor froze, heart pounding, yet the pressure in her chest urged her forward, compelling her nearer. She swore she could hear faint whispers from beyond the doors, not words but a chorus of sighs, beckoning her closer. She reached out, fingers trembling, and pressed her palm against the cold wood. At once, a violent shudder passed through the doors, as if something within had thrown itself against them in answer to her touch. Eleanor stumbled back with a gasp, the candle guttering nearly to darkness. The storm outside raged on, but the true hunger was within these walls. The house was no longer content to wait. It was calling to her, and each passing hour made it harder to resist. For days, Eleanor had resisted the pull of the locked wing, but the storm's whispers lingered in her mind long after the skies had cleared. Sleep offered no escape each night. She dreamt of doors opening themselves, of veils drifting through darkened corridors, of pale faces in mirrors that did not belong to her. At last, she could no longer endure the torment of not knowing. Armed with a single brass key she had stolen from the servants' quarters, its bow etched with a crest she did not recognize, Eleanor crept through the sleeping house and stopped before the forbidden wing. The air was colder here, thick with the smell of dust and neglect. The locks clung stubbornly to their rust, but with shaking hands she slid the key into one. It resisted, then gave way with a screech that seemed to echo down the hall. One by one the chains loosened, until at last the doors sagged open on their hinges, groaning as if they, too, resented intrusion. The chamber beyond was unlike anything Eleanor had seen. The air shimmered faintly, as though touched by unseen drafts, though the windows were shuttered tight. The room stretched long and high, its rafters lost in shadow. Against the walls stood mannequins draped in wedding gowns, some yellowed with age, others still bright as if freshly worn. Their headless forms leaned slightly, as though caught mid-step in some eternal procession. Suspended above them hung veils, scores of them, swaying gently though there was no wind. They floated in the air like pale specters, their lace edges quivering, brushing against one another in ghostly communion. Eleanor reached toward one, only to recoil as it drifted nearer, as if answering her gesture with a will of its own. At the center of the chamber loomed a massive mirror, its frame gilded, its surface rippling faintly like water disturbed. Eleanor's reflection stared back, wide-eyed and pale, but it was not alone. Behind her stood figures, women in gowns and veils, their faces obscured but their presence unmistakable. They crowded the glass, pressing forward as though the mirror were the only barrier between their prison and the living world. Eleanor staggered backward, her heart pounding. Yet the mirror pulled at her gaze, refusing to let her look away. For a moment, one of the veiled women lifted her head, and though her features were blurred by the shimmer of the glass, Eleanor knew with a certainty that chilled her blood that she was looking into the eyes of Margaret Duvall. The chamber was not a place of storage. It was a shrine, a grave, and a warning. And now Eleanor had stepped inside it, claimed by the house's memory as surely as all the brides who had come before her. Eleanor found Edward in the music room, his hands poised over the ivory keys of the grand piano, though he played no song. Candles flickered around him, throwing his face into a shifting play of light and shadow. He looked older in that moment, weary in a way she had not noticed before, as though the weight of centuries pressed upon his shoulders. She stood silently for a time, the echoes of what she had seen in the forbidden chamber still clinging to her mind, the gowns, the veils, the mirror of restless brides. Finally she spoke, her voice sharp but trembling. "How long did you expect me not to see? How long did you think I could live here without discovering the truth?" Edward's fingers stilled against the keys. He did not turn at once, but when he did, his expression was one of resignation rather than surprise. "I wondered how soon it would find you," he said softly. "It always does." Eleanor stepped closer, her fists clenched. "The house. The brides. What is this place, Edward? What have you done to them?" He rose from the bench with a slow grace, his eyes pale and unblinking. "It is not what I have done, Eleanor. It is what the house requires." His words chilled her more than anger could. She shook her head, refusing to accept the simplicity of his tone. "Requires? You speak as though it were alive. It is alive." He took a step toward her, lowering his voice as though confessing to a priest. "The Duvall Estate was built upon land that should never have been claimed. My ancestors bound it with rights they scarcely understood, sealing a pact they thought would bring prosperity. And for a time, it did. The house flourished, stood against storm and rot, when all others crumbled. But the price revealed itself soon enough. Each year, it demands a bride, a life bound to it, so its walls remain standing." Eleanor's chest tightened. "And, without one?" Edward's eyes darkened, as if he had already lived through the answer. "Without her, the estate falters. The walls decay. The roof caves. The gardens rot to ash. It is not only the house that dies, Eleanor. All within its reach are claimed. The curse spares nothing." She felt the air grow heavier, the silence pressing down between them like an unseen hand. "And you," she whispered. "You bring them here, knowing what awaits them?" His voice broke then, the first crack in his composure. "I have no choice. To refuse the house is to let it take us all." He paused, his gaze burning into hers. "And now, it has chosen you." Eleanor staggered back, her breath shallow. The walls seemed to lean inward, listening. The confession was no liberation, it was a sentence. And in that moment, she understood that she was not Edward's wife, she was his offering. The revelation gnawed at Eleanor long after Edward's words had fallen silent. She wandered the corridors in a haze, her footsteps muffled by the thick carpets, her thoughts drowned by the memory of the chamber filled with gowns and veils. She had imagined the fate of the brides to be cruel and unwilling, each one dragged screaming into the house's hunger. Yet what she uncovered next unsettled her more deeply than any violent end could. It began with the whispers. At first, faint, indistinct, a soft murmur against the stone walls when she lay alone at night. But as days passed, they grew clearer, weaving themselves into her very thoughts. The voices were not pleading as she had once believed, they were coaxing, promising, tempting. "We are not gone," one voice murmured as she brushed her hair before the mirror. "We are eternal here." Another came when she walked through the hall of portraits, the painted eyes glimmering faintly in the lamplight. "We did not suffer. We were chosen, and we chose in return." Eleanor's chest tightened as she clutched Margaret's diary, flipping back through its fragile pages. In the earlier entries, Margaret had written of fear, of resistance. But scattered between the desperate lines, Eleanor now noticed subtler tones, words that hinted at surrender, even awe. "The house shows me things beyond life. A place where time holds no sway. Perhaps it is not a curse." Eleanor set the book down, her hands trembling. Could it be true? Had these women walked willingly into the embrace of the house, not as victims, but as believers? The voices pressed closer that night, curling into her dreams. She dreamt of stepping through the mirror in the locked wing, where the brides waited for her in their veils. Their hands were cool, their faces serene, their eyes alight with something she could not name. Not sorrow, not torment, something nearer to ecstasy. When she awoke, her pulse thundered, but the whispers lingered, softer now, like a lullaby. They promised her release from the frailty of flesh, from the cruel march of years. She would not wither, nor be forgotten. Her name would not fade like the ivy-covered stones in the garden. Instead, she would remain, eternal and whole, bound to the house that endured. Eleanor pressed her hands over her ears, but the voices seeped through, filling her with a longing she could not deny. Perhaps the choice had always been hers, as it had been for the others. Perhaps the true horror was not the house devouring them, but the way it made them want to be devoured. The night of the offering arrived cloaked in silence, a stillness so profound it seemed the entire estate held its breath. The day had passed in a haze, the servants moving like shadows, their faces hidden, their voices hushed. Even Edward had spoken little, though the weight of his gaze upon Eleanor was unshakable. She knew this night had been decided long before her arrival, perhaps long before she was even born. As dusk fell, the air thickened with a heaviness that pressed into her bones. When Edward came to her chamber, he wore a solemn expression, his dark suit cut with sharp precision, a silver chain glinting against his waistcoat. He extended a gloved hand, and though her instinct screamed to flee, Eleanor found herself placing her trembling fingers in his. His touch was as cold as the stone walls around them. Without a word, he led her down the winding staircases of the estate, deeper and deeper into its bowels where no servant dared tread. The air grew damp, smelling of earth and extinguished fire, and the walls closed tighter with each turn of the spiral steps. At last, they emerged into a vast chamber, its vaulted ceiling vanishing into darkness. It was a chapel, but not one blessed by any holy light. Candles lined the walls, hundreds of them, their flames flickering yet never waning, as though sustained by something other than wax. Their glow cast the chamber in a trembling radiance, shadows stretching long and grotesque. At the far end rose an altar of blackened stone, its surface veined with cracks that pulsed faintly, like veins carrying blood. Eleanor's breath caught as she looked up at the walls. There hung portraits of the brides, one after another, stretching in a mournful procession around the chamber. Here, in the half-light, they seemed altered from the ones she had seen in the upper halls. Their eyes glistened with sorrow, and their painted faces shimmered as though wet with tears. Drops trickled down the canvas, dripping not paint but something darker, something that glistened like oil and blood. Edward guided her toward the altar. His voice, when he finally spoke, was low and reverent, echoing through the stone chamber. "This is the heart of the house. It has stood for over a century because it has been fed, renewed each year by devotion freely given." "Freely?" Eleanor whispered, her voice trembling. They were consumed. I've seen the graves, Edward. I've read Margaret's words. He turned to her then, and for the first time, his mask cracked. His eyes burned with both sorrow and desperation. They chose, Eleanor. The house does not force, it beckons. It shows them eternity, a place beyond decay. Do you not hear it too? The voices in the walls, the promises whispered in your dreams? She shook her head, though even as she did, the air hummed with 1,000 murmurs. They rose from the stones, from the portraits, from the very timbers of the chapel. Join us. Be remembered. Be eternal. The sound wrapped around her, seductive and suffocating. Edward raised her hand to his lips, brushing it with a cold kiss. Tonight, on the anniversary of its birth, the house asks again. It will stand only if you give yourself to it. Without you, it will crumble, and all within it will perish. The choice is yours, but no, Eleanor, it is no small choice. It is life, it is death, it is eternity. Eleanor's gaze swept the chamber. The weeping brides watched her from their frames, their painted tears dripping into the pools of candlelight. The altar loomed, waiting, pulsing faintly as though alive. The voices pressed harder, filling her chest with longing and terror alike. The night of offering had come, and with it, the moment of decision. The chapel had not yet released her. Even after Edward's solemn words faded into silence, Eleanor felt the weight of its hunger lingering in the air, pressing into her lungs with every breath. The candles burned on, their flames unwavering, and the portraits of the weeping brides seemed to lean forward in their frames as if to watch what she would do next. But Edward, ever calm, moved with practiced steps toward the rear of the altar. With a slow motion, he pressed his palm against the stone wall. A hidden mechanism groaned, and a section of the masonry slid aside, revealing a narrow staircase spiraling down into blackness. Eleanor hesitated, her body taut with dread, but Edward extended a hand, his voice soft, coaxing. "There is one more place you must see, before you decide." The descent was suffocating. The air grew colder, damper, and Eleanor thought she could hear faint weeping carried in the stone itself. The stair ended in a small, square chamber, and the moment her candlelight touched its contents, her breath hitched sharply. This was no chapel, no place of worship. It was a reliquary, a shrine built to house the remnants of every woman who had come before her. Along the walls stood pedestals, each bearing a single object under glass. A silver locket engraved with initials worn smooth by time, a pair of wedding rings, dulled with age, a veil folded neatly, its lace yellowed and brittle, a comb adorned with pearls. The intimate fragments of lives once lived, now reduced to tokens displayed for eternity. Eleanor's heart thudded painfully as she moved from one pedestal to the next, her reflection flickering across the glass as though she, too, were already part of the collection. Beneath each relic, an inscription carved in stone bore only a year, the same cruel anonymity she had seen in the Garden of Graves. No names, no voices, only objects left behind, robbed of their owners' identities. Her candle wavered as she reached the far end of the room. There, among the relics, stood a pedestal that bore nothing. Its glass case was pristine, untouched by dust. Beneath it, freshly carved into the stone, was the year 1904. The sight stole the breath from her throat. Her knees weakened, and she gripped the edge of the pedestal to steady herself. The case seemed to wait for her, hungry for a trinket that would one day be all that remained of Eleanor Whitmore. A ring she had worn, perhaps. A ribbon from her hair. A piece of herself, locked in stone as the house devoured the rest. Behind her, Edward's voice rose, reverent but hollow. "This is where the house remembers them. Not graves, not endings, preservations. Each bride has her place here, and soon you will too." She turned, her eyes blazing with something between fury and terror. "Do you not hear how monstrous that is? To be reduced to an object, a token, while the rest of me is consumed?" Edward's gaze softened, but his words were steady. "Monstrous, or merciful, The world forgets. Eleanor. Flesh withers, names fade. But here, you will remain. Eternal. The chamber pressed in on her, every relic whispering the truth of his words. The empty pedestal gleamed in the candlelight, patient and waiting, as if it already belonged to her. And in that terrible quiet, Eleanor understood. The house did not simply devour it, curated, immortalized. It was not enough to take their lives. It demanded to keep them forever. The night stretched on like an endless breath, the chapel's walls pressing close with their quiet hunger. Eleanor had been led back from the reliquary beneath, her head swimming with the sight of relics that had once belonged to women like her, women who had surrendered, who had allowed themselves to be catalogued as offerings to the Duvall Estate. The veil lay across her shoulders now, its lace brushing her cheek, soft as a whisper. It carried the faint scent of lilies and dust, of centuries of women who had worn it before. Edward stood at the altar, his expression calm but expectant. His hand extended toward her as though he were inviting her not into marriage but into a covenant older than either of them. The brides in the portraits above glistened with tears, their painted faces catching the shimmer of candlelight. The house thrummed beneath Eleanor's feet, alive and waiting. But where others might have yielded, Eleanor felt something within her ignite. A sharp clarity, born of terror and defiance, coursed through her veins. She lifted trembling fingers to the veil and tore it from her head with a violent tug. The lace ripped at the edges, threads snapping like brittle bones. She flung it to the ground, her voice rising in a cry that echoed through the vaulted chamber. "No more! I will not be your bride. I will not be consumed." The silence that followed was a silence unlike any other she had known. The house itself seemed stunned. Then the walls groaned, a deep, guttural sound that rattled through the foundation like the growl of a waking beast. Gas lamps lining the chapel flickered violently, flames stretching and snapping as if caught in a wind that did not exist. The floor trembled beneath her feet, dust raining from the vaulted ceiling. Edward's expression faltered, the calm mask cracking into horror. He took a step forward, his voice strained. "Eleanor, you do not understand what you've done." But she did understand. In tearing the veil, she had broken the cycle, disrupted the ritual that bound the house, and appeased its endless hunger. The portraits of the brides trembled on the walls, their painted eyes wide, their tears flowing faster, streaking down canvases in rivulets of black and crimson. The voices rose again, louder now, no longer whispers but a cacophony. Come back, join us, join us." They pressed against her mind, clawing, pleading, promising her eternity if only she would relent. But Eleanor stood firm, her chest heaving, her nails biting into her palms until she felt blood. The chapel shuddered as if the earth itself had taken offense. A crack splintered across the altar, jagged and wide, glowing faintly with a light that seemed to come from within the stone itself. Edward stumbled back, his eyes wide with fear, his hands reaching not for Eleanor but for the altar, as though to steady it, to beg it for forgiveness. The gas lamps flared so bright they nearly burst, plunging sections of the chapel into sudden darkness before reigniting with furious light. The air grew hot and suffocating, every breath scorched by the wrath of the house. But Eleanor did not bow. She stood in her torn gown, hair unbound, the veil trampled beneath her feet, a figure of rebellion in white. Her voice cut through the roar of the house, steady and fierce. "I am not yours. I will never be yours." The house groaned again, the sound of timbers splitting, of walls fracturing under the weight of her refusal. For the first time since she had arrived at the Duvall Estate, Eleanor felt the house recoil. And in that recoil, in the violent flicker of failing light, she tasted something sharp and dangerous: hope. The chapel had not stilled since Eleanor's defiance. The air quivered as if every breath she drew was stolen from the lungs of the house itself. Edward stood at the altar, his face half lit by the erratic flare of the gas lamps, his figure framed by the restless shadows of the chapel. Gone was the polished elegance, the soft-spoken assurance that had cloaked him like armor. His hands shook, his lips pressed tight, And for the first time, Eleanor saw something raw in him, fear. "You've doomed us both," he said at last, his voice low but shaking, as if each word came with splinters. "The house does not forgive. It will not forgive me. And it will not forgive you." Eleanor stared at him, unyielding. "Then let it crumble, let it rot into the earth." At this, Edward gave a hollow laugh, but it was not cruel, it was broken. His shoulders sagged, his frame seeming to shrink under the weight of the truth he had carried for too long. He moved down from the altar, each step unsteady, until he stood before her. For the first time, he looked less like a master of the estate and more like a man unraveling. "You don't understand," he whispered. "I have not aged a day in decades. I should be dust, a skeleton buried beneath the stones. But the house—" He lifted his trembling hands, pale and cold, as though presenting them to her as evidence. "The house bound me. It feeds me, sustains me, but only if I give it what it demands. Each bride is not merely sacrifice, they are the thread by which I am kept alive." His confession poured out like water breaking through a dam. "I was not always this way. I was the first to be chosen, once when the estate began its hunger. I was 19, much like you. My family was gone, the walls were already crumbling, and the house whispered to me, 'Take a bride, year after year, and it will keep standing. In return, I would never wither. I would never know death. But what is immortality when you are chained to stone?'" Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. She studied his face, suddenly aware of its peculiar stillness, the smoothness that no man of his years should possess. The polished elegance that had seemed aristocratic was nothing more than an unchanging mask, carved by the will of the house. "You let them die," she said, her voice trembling with fury. "All of them for this." Edward's eyes glistened in the candlelight, a mixture of sorrow and desperation. "I tried to love them. I told myself each time that perhaps one would understand. Perhaps one would even stay willingly. Some did. Some wanted the eternity the house promised. But none of them were free. And neither am I." The chapel rumbled again, the floor vibrating beneath their feet, the portraits above them groaning as if in judgment. The house was listening. It always listened. Edward turned his gaze upward, then back to Eleanor, his voice barely audible. "If you refuse the offering, the house will punish me first. It will take back every stolen year. It will make me wither into the husk I should have been long ago." He stepped closer, his hand reaching but stopping just short of her arm. "I do not ask for your mercy, I know I deserve none. But understand this, if the house loses me, it will not stop. It will turn on you next." Eleanor's heart pounded, torn between pity and rage. For the first time, she saw him not as the untouchable heir, but as another prisoner of the estate, a man who had traded his soul for survival. And yet, the knowledge only deepened her resolve. If the house had bound him, then perhaps the key to ending its reign was not submission but his release. Edward's mask had fallen, his confession staining the air between them. The house growled with hunger, but Eleanor met his hollow eyes and thought, "Then let it starve." The air in the forbidden wing felt heavier than any storm. Eleanor's steps echoed like intrusions as she pushed her way back into the chamber of mirrors and mannequins, the place where past veils floated like suspended phantoms. The house seemed to know she was coming, the very walls trembling with anticipation. She clutched at her skirts, her breath sharp and uneven, but her stride did not falter. Tonight was not a night for fear. Tonight was for refusal. The mirrors pulsed faintly, their silvered surfaces warping as if they had become pools of water stirred by invisible hands. Eleanor stood before them, her reflection multiplying endlessly, but each copy of herself was not quite her, each wore the faces of the brides who had come before. Margaret of 1889 stared back at her, lips trembling as though she wanted to speak. Then Clara of 1892, her veil torn and eyes hollow. Then another, and another, until the entire chamber was filled with a chorus of pale faces, all layered upon Eleanor's image. Their voices began, faint at first, but quickly swelling into a symphony of sorrow. Stay with us. We are waiting. We are eternal. The sound was unbearable. Dozens of voices weaving together, rising and falling like a dirge. Eleanor pressed her hands against her ears, but it was not enough. The voices were inside her, clawing at her mind, pulling at the strings of her heart. You do not have to suffer, whispered one voice, close as a breath against her neck. Here, you will never wither, never grieve. You will be one of us, forever cherished, forever kept. Another voice, stronger, pleaded, do not leave us alone in the dark. The house binds us, yes, but together we are not lonely. Together we endure. Eleanor's knees threatened to buckle beneath the weight of their longing. She could feel it, an ache so deep it tugged at the marrow of her bones. A part of her wanted to surrender, to fall into the arms of these spectral sisters and let the house cradle her in its cold embrace, to rest, to belong. But even as tears burned at her eyes, another thought rose like fire inside her. If she yielded, then what had she resisted for? If she joined them, the cycle would never end. Another girl would come next year, and another after that, each devoured in turn. And her soul, her freedom, would be nothing more than fuel for a hunger that never ceased. Eleanor straightened, her hands trembling but her chin lifting defiantly. No, she said, her voice cracking but fierce. You are not free. You are prisoners, and I will not be bound beside you. The chamber roared in response, the gas lamps flaring so bright they nearly burst. The mirrors shivered, cracking down their lengths, and the brides' faces contorted with grief and fury. Some wept, some screamed. Some reached out ghostly hands as if to drag her in. But Eleanor turned away. She refused to look at them, refused to let their longing chain her to the house. Every step she took toward the door felt like dragging her feet through a tide of sorrow. But she pressed on, her jaw tight, her fists clenched. As she crossed the threshold, the voices rose into a final, desperate wail. Do not leave us. Do not leave us. Eleanor stopped only once, her back to the chamber, her eyes wet but resolute. I will not be yours, she whispered. Then she shut the door, leaving the house to shake with the grief of its rejected brides. For the first time, silence followed her down the hall. And in that silence, Eleanor felt something she had not since her arrival at the Duvall Estate. Her own will, sharp and unbroken, leading her out of the shadows. The house woke in fury. From the moment Eleanor closed the chamber door, a rumble tore through the Duvall Estate, shaking its very bones. The chandeliers clashed against each other, raining glass across the marble floors. Portraits split down the middle as if slashed by invisible blades, the painted brides screaming as the canvas cracked and curled in flame. Eleanor ran through the trembling corridors, her gown catching on splintering wood, her breath burning in her chest. Behind her, Edward's voice rang out, not from any single place but from everywhere at once. It echoed in the walls, the ceilings, the floors, trembling with anguish. Eleanor, do not leave me. You cannot leave me. She burst into the grand hall. The staircase crumbled at its base, collapsing like the jaws of some great beast. From the landing above, Edward appeared. But he was no longer the polished heir who had once charmed her with cold elegance. His skin sagged in folds, gray and brittle, as if time itself had poured into him all at once. His hair, once glossy and dark, fell in tufts, leaving a withered scalp. His voice cracked with centuries. I gave everything, he cried, clutching the banister as his body shriveled with every breath. Every year, every bride, I gave to keep this house alive. Without it, I am nothing. Eleanor froze, horror flooding her veins. Before her eyes, Edward's figure crumbled further, his spine bending, his hands twisting into claws of bone. His eyes sank deep into hollow sockets, yet they clung to her with desperate hunger. Stay with me, he begged, his voice reduced to a rasp. Let the house take you. Let it live. and I will live. Don't leave me to die." The floor split between them, a jagged fissure glowing with fire from the foundations below. Eleanor backed away, her chest heaving. "You are already dead, Edward," she whispered, "and the house will die with you." The walls shuddered, beams groaning as the ceiling gave way. Fire licked across the tapestries, devouring their colors, spreading faster than she could breathe. Edward's scream rose above the chaos, not just in his throat but in every stone, every timber. It was the scream of the estate itself, centuries of hunger undone in a single moment of refusal. Eleanor turned and fled. She dodged falling plaster, leapt over burning debris, her hands raw from clawing open heavy doors. The front hall yawned before her, and beyond the shattered stained glass windows she saw a night sky, a promise of escape. She pushed through the great doors as they groaned on their hinges, flames chasing her shadow. The iron gates loomed ahead. She stumbled toward them, the gravel path shaking beneath her feet. Behind her, the house bellowed its final roar, a collapsing beast of fire and stone. Edward's last cry split the night, shrill and human for only a heartbeat before fading into nothing but the thunder of falling walls. Eleanor threw herself past the gates, just as the estate gave way. The roof caved inward, towers collapsing into the inferno. Sparks rained into the sky like dying stars. Then, with a final shudder, the Duvall estate crumbled to ash. She turned, her chest heaving, her hair tangled with soot. The once proud house was nothing more than a blackened skeleton, its stones sinking into the earth as smoke curled upward. Only fragments of lace and veils lifted into the air, scattered by the wind, dissolving into the night. Eleanor gripped the iron gate with trembling hands. The estate was gone, the curse broken. The brides, whatever remained of them, were finally free. And she, the last bride who refused, stood in the cool night beyond the ruins, her body bruised, her spirit unbowed. For the first time since arriving, she breathed not the air of the house, but her own.